I'm Scott Morris, and the piece that I just played is the first nocturne from the 5 nocturnes by Satie, and that's one of the scores in my phonology, the music of Satie for the guitar, which is a book of scores as well as a CD recording of all the music in there. And I thought what I would do here is sort of overlap this project of Satie with some of the concepts in my Classical Guitar Complete series, and also a little bit of a preview to the 3rd volume of Classical Guitar Complete, which should be out hopefully by the end of 2014, which is Classical Guitar Complete from Practice to Performance. And in that book, in addition to a whole bunch of exercises and things like that, there'll be a whole thing on how to take a piece of music you're looking at for the first time, or if you want to improve something you've been playing, ways to do that. And what I'd like to talk about with this piece is just, how do you sit down with a piece of music for the first time? And a couple things that I think everybody should do before you start playing a piece is you need to do some background research on the music. So, know something about the composer. What style is it? I think a lot of guitar players, students, amateurs, and some others, kind of play every piece from every style sort of the same way, and they just sort of make everything sound like, it's sort of the same thing. But what I like to do is, if I'm playing a piece of, say, early 20th century French music like this, I really like to understand the style as opposed to maybe early 19th century music, or maybe Renaissance or Baroque music. You really have to know a bit about the style, so you have to immerse yourself in that style. And that's why, when you're a music student at university or conservatory, they make you take those music history classes, so you know something about the historical context of the piece. There's that. Other things. I think it's important to, if it's not a brand new work, but if there are recordings that exist. In this case, there are plenty of recordings of piano versions of this piece. Listen to them, really study them, get them in your ear. That can tell you a whole lot and save you a whole bunch of time. So style, decide on a tempo. In this case, Satie did actually mark in a metronome marking here. Other sorts of things. What key are you in? In this case, you're in D major. So review your patterns in D major to sort of see where it's going to fall on the guitar. So one of the most important things when starting a piece, just looking at the beginning here, I'll just play the first couple measures. They have like the first 4 or 5 measures. Make sure you understand the rhythm and the meter. In this case, it's a 12/8. And you should know with a compound time signature, a 12/8 is really going to feel like a 4/4. So you don't want to sit here and count like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's not going to give you the right feel. So you need to understand that this is really going to feel more like a 4. So the dotted quarter note is the beat. So it's like, these triplets. Etc. So make sure you understand the meter and you know what the proper feel is for that. Now, when I'm just looking at a piece for the very first time, I like to sight read it through. So pretend I'm just doing this for the very first time. So I'm looking at the first bit, and I've got a lot of fingerings in my arrangement here. But whether you do or whether you don't, go through. Just do your best, just to get a feel for where you might want to play that, and have a pencil out and write in your fingerings as you go. I like to go through the piece like that pretty early on. Try to avoid the old guitar trap. Maybe other musicians do it too, but I find it's really rampant in the guitar world, which is let's learn one measure, get it up to tempo, then let's learn the second measure and get that up to tempo. The problem with that is you don't get a really good overview for the piece, so everything's out of context, and your interpretation sometimes ends up sounding like a patchwork of different little licks that have been practiced. So you definitely do not want to do that. And as you're going through the score, with your pencil, make sure you understand all of the markings in the piece. In this case, a lot of things are in French, and if you're fluent in French, that's great. But if you're not, you should definitely have, maybe a music dictionary, or, now I guess you just do it online. But make sure you understand what all of the markings are telling you to do. And with Satie, sometimes that can be a little bit confusing, because he can write some pretty wacky things in. But for the most part here, he's writing things like, slow down, this should be really big sounding here, wait, he likes to write in various places. So make sure you understand all that stuff, because if you don't, you could be missing some really valuable piece of information that the composer is trying to tell you that will help you in your interpretation. Okay, so let's just assume we've sort of gone through the piece, and very lightly in pencil, written in some fingerings. Do it in pencil for sure, because you're going to change your mind in a lot of places. I just kind of like to get an idea, early on, sort of like where this might work, where that might work. And I change my mind all the time with pieces. Pieces I played for 20 years, I'll write new fingerings in, because I think of something else that maybe it works a little bit better technically or musically. Okay, so some of the other questions you need to really look at here is, what is the musical texture of the piece? So, taking a look at this in the first few measures again. So, identify the melody. This is critical. So there's your melody. And you've also got this, it's almost like a walking bass line. So on and so forth. So you've got to make sure when you're learning this piece that you're bringing out that melody on top. Now, there are a couple other things going on here. It sort of seems like maybe it's just a simple walking bass, but I like to, on those downbeats, let that note in the bass actually ring a little bit, so it creates a little bit more, harmony than, if I were just, chop them all like that. So if you listen, there's a C that I let ring underneath that G, and that C sharp keeps ringing even though the bass line continues. There's a B there. Then here's an A in the bass, C sharp, and so on and so forth. Also, there's that F sharp that comes in there. It's just written as an eighth note, but remember, music notation is shorthand. It's not to be taken literally most of the time. So even though it's written as an eighth note, I'm not going to play, I'm going to play this. So that F sharp is going to ring. Now here, it's three voices really. So I've got the melody, this measure 3, and then I've got this middle voice, then like a really low bass line now. Right, so together. So my point is, don't just try to get the notes right and the rhythm right, but make sure you understand what each line of the music is doing. What is the purpose of each one of those notes? Is it in the bass? Is it some middle voice? If it's the melody, that's really important. So make sure that you're aware of all of these things. And sometimes it's not really clear in the beginning, and you need to spend some time with the piece to really discover that. So, a couple other things that you definitely want to think about as you're looking at a piece is use your theory. If you're well versed in music theory, or even if you're just you know a bunch of chords, That's great. When you recognize a chord, a lot of classical players, they'll play, a chord and they'll think of it as, oh, this finger goes here, this finger goes here, this finger goes here. And, they're not really conscious of the fact that maybe it's a really recognizable chord. If the chords have names, they're a lot easier to remember. Likewise, if there's like a melodic line, what scale is it based on? So you should be aware of these things as you're going through. Okay, so let's get into some technical stuff here. Now, in the beginning here, as I mentioned, now that I kind of know where the melody is, you don't want your hands to undermine maybe a really good understanding of the music. So you have to make sure you've got really efficient fingers. And what I like to do when I'm going through and writing in fingers, I try to take advantage of all of the things that can make the left hand work more efficiently. And that means be aware of things like opportunities for guide fingers. Try to avoid sometimes with especially music not written for the guitar, this isn't all that guitaristic. There might be some awkward way you have to hold the chord because of what's coming next. Maybe it's like a simple D major chord, but you have to hold it in a different way. I'll give you an example of that. In bar 6, here's this little, little refrain that keeps coming back, happens later on. All right, so that's bar 15. And that is just a good old D major chord. Here, A major, but it doesn't matter which one, it's the same fingering. But a lot of people would say, oh, a D major chord, so just play it like that, and I might even bar it. The problem is, where this needs to go, that's not going to work. Because it goes into this minor shape, and I want to keep guide fingers. So I have to do an unusual fingering for a very common chord shape. As opposed to like a, don't do things like that. And again, that's where the pencil comes in. Write these things in as you go along. Now, when you come across a section that's really technically difficult, and there are a couple of these in here. For instance, measure 8, you've got this pitch. Right, that's pretty hard, this little build. So here, I've got F sharp and A against an open B. And it may seem at first thought maybe 1 and 3 is good there. Problem is you're moving to a bar here in second position. So what I do is I use 4 and 2 like that. Then I can prepare my bar. Right, then I prepare 2. 3 is prepared. Relax the bar. Bar goes back down. Then here, even though that's only 2 frets above, you may think, third finger, perfect. Problem is, third finger is going to be needed here on the very next note. So I use 4 here so I can prepare 3, and then I can use 4 as a guide finger, and 3 goes down on that F sharp. So these are just the sorts of things that you want to do as you go through the piece to make it as easy as possible. So again, it may not seem like the most obvious fingering at first, but you have to be really open-minded with these things, because what might seem kind of hard at a slow tempo, like, oh, that's a weird way to hold that chord, or I don't usually do that, or my hand's sort of in a weird position, that may be the most effective and efficient way to play that particular section. So a couple other little things to think about here. And again, I've got lots of fingerings written into this, but there's what I think is the hardest part of the piece is actually right after what I just played, which is bar 10. So you come out of this, and you have this really nasty leap up to that, then like that. Well, here, the most obvious thing is, well, you've got this open B. If you have a hard leap and you have an opportunity to play an open string, you should definitely do that. So here, that B will save you. So you have this little chord before, open B, hold that as long as you can, fly up, get that quick. So shift on that open string and get there as quickly as possible. Best way to practice that is, to play so you're really clear on what it is you're going for, and then when you can just fly right to it, right? Just like that. So, go through the tough spots. And one of the things I like to do when I'm learning music, and especially when I'm learning a lot of music, is I'll create what I call tricky bits. So, I've got this little scrapbook, and what I do is I photocopy my music on my home scanner, and I, cut out this measure, which I find difficult, or maybe these two measures over here, and then I paste those into a Word doc, and I print that out. So I've actually got something in my folder with all of the hard parts from all of my pieces. So, sometimes you don't have time to, practice everything. But there's some things I definitely don't want to avoid if I'm practicing. So I've got my little tricky bits thing there. So that's definitely on my tricky bits scrapbook there. Okay, so a couple other little things that you really need to think about. I mentioned the expression markings before. Sometimes they're in a foreign language, and maybe they're unclear, whatever they might be. But some are really obvious, like dynamics. So piano, pianissimo, forte. Here there's not a lot of loud. It's mostly piano, pianissimo. I think the loudest it really gets is mezzo forte in there. Exaggerate your dynamics as much as possible. Something like this section here. And then it goes to a little crescendo there. Pianissimo. What I like to do is to try to brighten it up on those quiet bits, because if you're playing in a big room, or even if you're not, if you play really warm and really quiet, you can lack clarity. Like that. So brighten it up when you play quietly, and it'll make what's happening musically hopefully more clear. Now, the little crescendo after, what I recommend with crescendos is always start a little bit quieter, so then you've got some room to go from there. Okay, so again, just kind of flying through this here. As you move into the middle part of the piece, it gets pretty tricky with the chords. Here I definitely recommend, going through and just making sure you have the best fingerings for all those chords, and they're pretty confusing at first because it gets really chromatic here. So here I've got the D, bar is prepared, 2 is prepared for the G sharp, right? 3 is prepared, 4, shift up, and then here's the harp one. Got to get down there to that. Then open string. So remember what I said, shift on those open strings. Another one, shift. Here, right, that chord's really tricky, but if you know your chord shapes, like, oh, that's just a little diminished chord there, so no big deal. Right down, G major, D7, crescendo, start quiet, something like that. Then piano. Here's the only forte bit in the whole piece. This is the pickup going into measure 23. Okay? And then the beginning comes back. So you really want to, exaggerate the contrast here. And really gentle. Repeat from the opening section there. It gets really chromatic, as you get closer to the end. And I was worried about these fingerings, so I wrote them all in, just for those who start to notice, like, oh, it's just an E major. major chord. But then it gets really... So you have to make sure you have good fingerings. Bad fingerings here, it's not going to go very well. So follow the fingerings in the score here. If you don't like them, you're welcome to change them. But at least consider them before you do that. Since trust me, I tried a lot of different ways to make this work before deciding on these fingerings. Now, the endings of pieces are so important. It's the last thing people hear, obviously. So these are pianissimo, so really gentle. Right, so you're right. So really slow and slow down in French there. So you want to exaggerate all these things. What I find with musical expression is generally you want to exaggerate things. Sometimes you feel like you're doing a crescendo, or you feel like you're playing a little bit slower, you feel like you're accenting that chord, or you feel like whatever. But it may not be coming across to your audience quite that way. I like to think about like stage performers. If you ever go to the theater and you're in the audience, the gestures and expressions from the actors on stage may seem normal, but if somebody were to act like that in real life, they'd lock them up. The arm gestures are really exaggerated. The facial expressions are really exaggerated. Everything's really exaggerated so that the person sitting 50 rows back can see clearly what is being portrayed by the actor. So that's not normal, a normal way to express oneself, but that's what's required when you're on stage. And the same thing is true when you're playing music. You may be picking up on your crescendo, or you may be picking up on your tone difference, or you may be picking up on whatever, the accelerando or the ritardando. But that doesn't mean your audience is going to pick up on it. So exaggerate it, and what you think is probably too much is probably almost enough, maybe not quite enough. Sometimes I think, I'm doing all this real dramatic stuff and listen to a recording and go, well, I can barely notice a lot of that stuff. So then I have to go back and do it again and, exaggerate it. And I think, all right, now that sounds fine. So anyway, these are just some of the thoughts that I have on picking up a piece of music. And, what I've done here in just a few minutes, actually, of course, is something that, you would spend a fair amount of time on. When I'm learning a piece of music, depending on how hard it is, maybe it's a couple weeks or months. I've had pieces where I've worked on them for years before I felt comfortable playing them in front of anybody, really. So don't rush yourself. And this is just to make some basic decisions. Getting it up to a performance level, well, that's a completely different discussion. This is just getting your fingerings, making some musical decisions. And then here's the difference, from what a lot of students and amateurs think to professionals. After I've done all the stuff that I just talked about, which is making sure I've got my fingerings and I can get through it and play it, and I've got musical ideas that I want to express. Now I can begin to really work on the piece. Meaning, that's all prerequisite to starting to work the piece up to a performance level. So now the work really begins. And that's a discussion for another day. We will be posting a free download of Nocturne number 1 on the website, and there should be a link to that in the video description below. So feel free to print that out and share it with your friends, or just yell at it. That's healthy too. Either way, hope you got something out of this, and I'll see you next time.